Hello, and welcome to episode 71 of the Following Mechanical Turks project. So at this juncture, we're beginning preliminary work on the third product, where we're looking at how theory emerges from the operations of Mechanical Turk. We're still sort of collecting feedback on the second piece, which is live on the site, but there are some other reviewers who are taking a look at it. So it's the gist of where we are and what we'll talk about today. So, Athena, you mentioned that the pieces have been kind of distinguished by approaches or methods. So the first one we kind of looked at text mining, quantitative text mining. The second one, we were doing an experiment based on surveys, right? Seeing what feedback we were getting from Turkers who were responding to hits that we posted, asking them to summarize particular content and then evaluate the task itself. So we collected surveys on that and processed those. So this third piece, we've sort of throughout the project been framing it as theoretical, but potentially theoretical, not necessarily in terms of applying a pre-existing theoretical framework to what we're encountering and then explaining it that way.
Yeah.
But perhaps going in a sort of the inverted direction of that.
Yeah, I think so, right? The notion that we're not going to be sort of theorizing about Turks, but trying to figure out, what are sort of extant theoretical approaches that would sort of let us get a sense of, right, on the general arc of the project, which is, right, we're not coming to Mechanical Turks with some idea of what the human is and then assessing to what extent it's in line with that understanding of the human, but instead, right, how is it in terms of its text, right? The first piece, how is it describing the human textually? And then the second one, right, how is it, the notion of taskscape, right? How is it, what notion of the human does it have based on the kinds of text or tasks that get arranged? And so this third piece would then be, right, does it actually, across those discursive and procedural operations, right, what theory of the human does it have? And so I think that's then sort of thinking about what are various concepts or terms or theory that we could sort of assemble in order to sort of sound out what that might be. So I think that's right. The discussions we've had about cultural techniques, right? The whole sense that a concept is generated by a particular arrangement of media. So is, the idea that the door creates the conceptual difference between inside and outside, the idea that a fence creates the conceptual distinction between the human and the non-human. And so that was kind of one that we've been, that's sort of been latent or dormant throughout the whole process. But then I started making like a list of other things that could get us back into that, right? So we've developed this notion of the taskscape.
For the second piece in particular.
Yeah. The notion of telling, which has also been useful both because it's, right, what does the system actually sense, and then how does it articulate stuff? And then also, right, thinking about that, this raises the question too of thinking about, which we've also been thinking about this whole project, right? Like who's this project for? What's its audience? And so I think one of the things that I think is a strong connection between the end of the second one and this one is sort of what does rhetorical theory in particular have to bring to this conversation? So the notion of the enthymeme, I think maybe going back to our conversations with Hanrahan about like what we would call like arrangement.
Mm.
And it strikes me that those notions of like enthymeme and arrangement, and even telling could potentially be, those seem potentially resonant with the larger conversation of cultural technique. We could very much understand as like, how do particular arrangements generate particular concepts or definitions of terms. So that's kind of what I've been, thinking through, is sort of, if we have to like describe an early on in the piece articulation of our method, is that we're not theorizing about mechanical Turks or the M-Turk, right? We're trying to sort of, I don't know, theorize with it, which also brought me back to the conversation that we had with Jim Brown, right? That there's arguing about software, there's arguing in software, there's arguing with software. And so, yeah, thinking about that was useful again, because right, we're not saying something about mechanical Turk. We're trying to sort of see what theory gets generated in it. And then it strikes me that cultural techniques, arrangement, enthymeme, these are all sort of theoretical frameworks that keep you in the thing as opposed to outside of the thing.
Well, let me ask this, I guess, to, play devil's advocate.
Yeah.
What's the difference?
Yeah.
And that's something that's come up in feedback with the idea is, just because you say you're not doing something doesn't mean you're not doing it, right?
Yeah.
So, what's the difference between, because as you point out, like we have some theoretical framework,
right,
that we're importing from other things. There are some things that seem to have emerged from the piece, like telling. You mentioned telling, right? That wasn't like a concept that we identified in other work and then said, oh, well, you can see it here. It's something that, we, more or less coined based on what we saw, particularly in the first piece, with kind of the things that seem characteristically human, right? Things like trauma, where it's, so what we were seeing is something that's characteristically human in this arrangement. What the role of the human is making the self known. Interestingly, it's like what human is making the human visible. It's articulating not just that I am sensing something, but I am a particular sensor doing this.
Yeah.
So in a sense, it's like, okay, we could say that's emerging from the piece, but the other things, like cultural techniques, it's like, well, that's a critical apparatus we're bringing to it. So I guess the question is, so what's in the third piece that isn't us doing, isn't us interpreting stuff through a pre-existing critical lens?
Yeah.
Not that there's anything wrong with it. It's just,
No, it's why I have the like little scraps of paper, because I'm trying to like, is that actually what we're doing, or is it right? Am I protesting too much that no, we're not doing that, when it's precisely what we're doing.
And that comes up a lot in well, I don't know, maybe it's not fair, but like in part because it's what we're looking at, but like in materialism a lot, people will say, well, no, what we're doing is not applying traditional notions of agency, but it's like, yeah, but you still are, right?
Yeah.
Asserting that you're not doing something isn't in and of itself different from doing it. I think you then have to articulate, okay, well, here's then the difference.
Yeah. Partially it's
is one way out of this, maybe, and I don't know, but is it like what we're trying to do in the third piece is figure out the many ways that this, constellation of things is itself kind of continually defining these categories, like human or like
Yeah.
labor. So it's like what we're doing is trying to see how it itself is a sort of theory machine.
Yeah. Oh, I like that. Yeah, and in that sense, we are using theory the way that it's normally used, right? We're using theory as a method of observing some coherent thing that we can make sense of via theory. But what we are doing theory about is how is we're, I don't know, theorizing theory. But the theory machine, I think then, yeah, right, that we're trying to use these various existing theories or concepts to get a sense of mechanical Turks as itself a theory machine. So maybe we're sort of theorizing alongside it,
Hmm.
right? In the same way that, right, we were using computational rhetoric and text mining to sort of, I think we even use language, right? We're trying to sort of sound out what it's doing, right? We were sort of using these, like early on, I think, right, sort of sonar like metaphor, right? That we're
Yeah.
um and similar to the second one, right? So there's a sense in which we're going to ping off of mechanical Turks, right? We're going to, one ping only with cultural techniques and one ping only with enthymeme, right? And then see what theory machine we can discern using
Hmm.
those, right? So how does something like cultural techniques allow us to understand? Because in many ways, right, that's what cultural techniques is, right? It is clearly a theory, but it's designed to see what kind of theory a door is doing.
Ah,
So,
yeah.
so in that sense, right, that's right. It's the idea that right, which is why when I introduce the concept of, I mean, part of this too hinges on how people sometimes understand theory, right? Like one of the reasons I like this progression is that no, theory is just another practice alongside, right? The whole theory, we could get Casey Boyle on here about this, right? That the theory practice distinction makes no sense because theory is just another kind of practice,
You
right?
see it as a method
Yeah,
comparable to the
it's
previous
another kind
two.
of method that's largely predicated upon, right? I mean, when Aristotle writes rhetoric is the ability to see in any given situation the available means of persuasion, right? He uses theoria for see, right? It's a practice of observation. It's a practice of, interestingly enough, like spectatorship. So you're in the crowd doing it. So it's got also some interesting, it's not exactly outside because you have to be in the thing observing it, right? So theory is just a particular a practice of observation, but it's an observation that's sort of invested, right? Like you're not just observing it's linked to words like theater. And so yeah, that in other words, right, that this theory piece is not like we're not building up to it. In other words, like the text mining that we did and the ethnography, and now we're going to then subsume all of that in a theory. Like, no,
Yeah.
this is exact. We're just doing the same thing again. In other words, like, no, we're not building up to the theory piece that then, right? Like some people will imagine theory. Now the theory is going to come in and make sense of all of that. Well, I think what we're doing in this piece is like, no, we've used computational rhetoric, we've used something vaguely ethnographic, and now we're using a particular set of theories, but that those all exist side by side.
Yeah. And I don't see that second piece as ethnography
Yeah, probably not the right term to use.
because, well, we're not profiling the Turker. I mean, we kind of point out it's like there is ethnography, including by Hanrahan.
Yeah,
I mean, what we're really doing is survey, as a method or
yeah,
experiment, including
yeah,
survey. But I mean, I take your point there. I mean, I wonder then, like, is it useful? You mentioned Casey. I mean, is it useful to the same as we did with the others, like gesture toward what we're doing here is a a methods, a theory as method approach. And
Yeah.
here are folks who, um, who do that. So it's like, we're not doing something wholly novel. It's like,
No. Oh, yeah.
do you know what I mean? It's like, so in the others we pointed to, it's like, here's the approach and here are folks who back that. It's like, I talk about this with my research methods students, where it's like, if you're saying I'm doing a survey, it's helpful to point out, just as a means of contextualization, it's like, here are other studies that approach a similar topic through a similar means as a way of backing, here's
Yeah.
why
Yeah.
I'm doing what I'm doing. Or if you can even do something like adapt questions that were asked of a different population, but adapting them for your population, it's like, it's a good answer for why are you doing what you're doing. It's like, well, it's accepted disciplinary practice, as you can see from Smith and Jones, and I'm using these questions in particular because Thomas did this with a similar population. I'm just applying per global one to this localized
Yeah.
population. It's like, I don't know if we have to, but it's like, it may make sense then to gesture to, it's like, well, why are you doing what you're doing? Why is that a good idea? And it's like,
Yeah.
well, here are people who do something similar, I mean, and maybe in part that's like what cultural techniques, as you mentioned, can do. It's like,
Yeah.
well, it is a way of viewing how the door is theorizing what it separates,
Yeah.
how it invents the separation that it seems to demarcate.
Yeah.
Similarly, it's like, I think it's raining here, sorry. Similarly, we are not just approaching through cultural techniques, but we are similarly trying to get our arms around how Mechanical Turk kind of repeatedly churns out these phenomena like the human, like labor.
Yeah. I'm writing that down.
Write that down.
That's good.
Pushing
That's
over a fern. Write that down.
good. No, I think Theory Machine is a. It also reminds me of there's an article by Latour and a computer scientist that's called, I think it's called like the Hume Machine, and it's all about the idea of the Latour's interest in association. So so the idea, and this may be less true now because this piece is older, but it's the idea that yeah, and it's the idea that since computer, once it's shed its anthropomorphic and epistemological projections, is already capable of dealing with significant association networks. I mean, weirdly enough, and since there is no computer program on the market for researchers in the social sciences that deal with a great number of heterogeneous textual sources, so part, it's dated, so there's a weird way in which you could kind of update it. But essentially the point, is that computers are too, I think it's a line somewhere, computers are too dumb to dream. And what he means by that is that computers don't, in Latour's terminology, they don't explain. They just describe, they just associate over and over and over again. And they never get to the point where a human would get and go, I see the singular thing that explains all of this, right? So it's part of Latour's sort of notion of irreductions, right? Nothing can be reduced to anything else. And that because computers can't help but just generate more and more associations, they're useful in that sense, right? Because they don't theorize in the sense we normally think of theory, as sort of boiling everything down to a couple of components, right? In the sense that, so what a computer will do is it won't tell you what a human is. It will just keep giving you iterations of that.
It's interesting.
It can just, all it can do is associate. It can't reduce. in
It's
the way that
interesting.
humanism will be like, right, we see all these things humans are doing, but
Right.
there's these three things that are actually what really makes you human. And we can use those to explain all the other things, right? I mean, this is generally like you can't use the social to explain anything because the social itself is what you have to explain. Right. And our project is similar. Like you can't use the human to make sense of mechanical Turks because the human is itself is what is being, it's at stake through mechanical
Yeah.
Turks. So that, but your notion of the theory machine, right, made me think of that article, right? The Hume machine.
Yeah. It's interesting. Yeah. I mean, so, and I haven't read this. I don't know when this was written, although the font suggests it's a little earlier because it uses this rounded font that you don't see in contemporary pieces. Let's say it looks like 95, so it's not deep time. Um, but interesting in the wake of, would how would this be revised um, now? But that notion of like, yeah, because I think, maybe what we're scratching at there is like deduction, right? I mean, something, um, or excuse me, I guess it would be induction, right? Because I mean, there's kind of two primary moves there. You're either deducing from something you know is true, right? Moving from necessarily true premises to a necessarily true conclusion, like the syllogism, all humans are mortal. Socrates is a human, therefore he's got to be mortal. It's like,
Yep.
those have to be true, therefore the consequence has to be true. Induction tends to be the method that we associate with things like science, where it's like, I see all these observations, there has to be an explanatory principle. Every time we push something off the table, it
Right.
drops. We have to induce, there's an overarching thing that explains that, like gravity or, love previously.
Yeah.
It's interesting because, I haven't read this piece, but the language now that's been being used to describe particularly chat programs, Microsoft's Bing Chat, which is sometimes called Sydney. We talked about this last time, that a persona emerged from its chat named Sydney. I think it calls itself that, in fact. But it's not the whole thing itself. It's a persona within that chat device.
Right.
It's also ascribed to ChatGPT as well, but what the language that's being used is hallucination,
Yeah.
that the machines are hallucinating. One example of this was someone asked, I think it was ChatGPT, hey, who's going to win the Super Bowl? And it speaks, as it often, well, perhaps always does, definitively. It was like, oh, the Eagles won after a hard fought back and forth on a last second field goal. And it gave the score. And, curiously, the game almost played. It didn't, but it almost seemed, because it ended really on a penalty that was setting up precisely that scenario, although
Yeah.
the score would be different. But the language that's been used to describe this is hallucination. It speaks with certainty about things that are not.
Right.
And so that's the language that's used. I mean, it's not dream, but it's like, no, you're hallucinating this. This didn't happen, but for you, it's real.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting because, like, we always have to broach this through metaphor.
Right.
Kevin Kelly does that in What Technology Wants, where, he's intentionally like saying want, even though it's like, I know they don't want in the same way, but what I want to do there is set a pole where it's like we speak of the machine in these kind of circumscribed ways. So what I want to do is throw out, it's like drag the Overton window over by throwing out something that's far away from this,
Right.
to drag it. It's like, yeah, but we're very much kind of circumscribed in the way we see these things. So to pull our shared understanding of it over, it's like, I want to talk about them in hyperbolic ways, sort of.
Yeah. There was, so two things. There was a talk, I got to get the name. It was a panel at the Society for Arts, Literature, and the Sciences. And he talked about AI like tripping, like on, like, like on LSD, but it was very similar to hallucination thing. There's also, going back to our talk with Casey Boyle, right? That instead of induction or deduction,
Yeah.
what we're seeing is probably something like transduction, right? So rather than like, I've got a bunch of particular things from which I derive a human, or I've got the human, and then from there, I then find all these human-like things, it's much more iterative, right? So that what Mechanical Turks is doing is it's just transducing the human across all of these tasks. And the form that the human takes is a function of the medium itself.
Right.
So that, and I think that's kind of potentially what maybe even, I have to go back, it's been a long time since I read it too, is that notion of association is like, but it's not building towards anything, right? There's just those associations at any given moment. And so rather than, from a bunch of particulars, you arrive at a definitive thing.
Yeah.
It's a way like, no, there's just particulars.
Yeah.
And you need a system that allows you to sort of negotiate and navigate those particulars.
Yeah. I mean, that might be interesting. I mean, in light of this work that does talk about a reductionist, that's the language it uses, a reductionist tendency. That, yeah, I mean, if it's like other Latour stuff, it probably pushes back against that tendency, that it's like, yeah, I mean, we don't explain it. And that's, I mean, I don't think we're attempting to explain, okay, well, here's why it does it, or what it's doing is simply a manifestation of this other, it's simply a manifestation of economic forces or whatever.
Right.
This notion of whatever it is you're observing, there's a secret meaning under it. This is all just because we want oil money or whatever. That, yeah, it's like, if what we're doing then is observing its particulars, here's a, not an issue, but it's like, here's a consequence of that. And I think to an extent, it's like, probably this is something that someone like Latour may have to do a lot, where it's like, okay, then what's the value in doing that? If it's like, well, we can't come to like a general principle, a general explanatory principle, what's the value in just observing its iterations?
Right.
I don't know if I have an answer to that.
Well, this would be, I mean, it strikes me that in part, this was something I was trying to do in that little talk I gave to my department that was dove into this a little bit, is right. So from rhetorics, in the sense that, rhetoric is, okay, I got to reset. In other words, the value is that, in other words, okay. We could say that in many ways that begs the question, right? That if it doesn't offer a definitive principle, then it's not valuable. It's like, well, how is that the only the value that would come from this? Is, in other words, where I landed is going back sort of Lanham's sort of Q question thing, right? Is that the problem is the begged question, and potentially what our approach would offer is, right, it wouldn't give you an answer, but potentially it gives you a better set of questions to ask, right? So if you're going into, so the argument I was basically making is, if you're looking at something like Chat GPT and your primary question is it authentically intelligent or not? My argument was that question is not going to help you actually answer any of the problems you actually have with this, right? The problems you have with this are the way that it organizes labor, the kind of writing that it produces. I have stylistic problems with it, right? Whether it's actually artificially or truly intelligent is just a spurious, it's not a helpful question, right? To finally know what it is, would in no way resolve any of the problems that
Yeah.
it generates, right? Well, we know it's not authentically human. Who gives a like? What is that actually? That's that principle that you have that it's not human is totally useless because you can't deploy it in any meaningful way to stop it, right? Like, yeah, but Your Honor, it's not human. Oh, okay. Well, let's unplug it, right? Like that's what do you? It's that kind of philosopher's gambit. Like if we know what it is, then that in some sense gives us any kind of purchase on it. And it's like it it doesn't, right? Like that doesn't help you at all. It just means you're on the sidelines going, that was an ad hominem attack. Okay, great. What's knowing what it is? What has that ever done for you?
Yeah. I mean, and I'm sympathetic to that, although potentially it does, I mean, it does maybe something, but it's like it may be that what it's doing, it's like it doesn't resolve it, it just pushes it back one. So for example, it's like if you can say, okay, well, this is genuine human intelligence, then potentially what it does is it allows or disallows certain things. I mean, you mentioned it's like, well,
Right.
does that mean then because we've deemed it to be human intelligent or genuinely intelligent, that means, well, I can't delete it, or it means it can in some way be held liable in a legal case, right? So it's
Right.
like, the way that it once we, if we call it a war on drugs, this is that,
Yes,
then it
yes, yes.
allows and disallows certain things just because of the unpacking of that metaphor, right?
Right, right,
So
right,
there's
right.
a sense in which it's like resolving the essentialist question. In a sense, it does like permit and prevent certain things, although it's not necessarily the case that it's the essentialist question has done that. It's just you've now you've found a means to allow X or Y, right?
Yeah,
Calling this the war on drugs doesn't actually resolve that it is. I mean, even if we okay, it is or it isn't, it's like that's not what it does. What it
right,
does is it means I can put unlimited dark funds behind this.
right.
What it
And I
means, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
no, I think I mean that's basically the taskscape, right? That what the answer does is right, that what calling it the war on drugs is right. You right, that's what it is. But that doesn't do anything. But what it does is it generates a taskscape in which you can spend money this way or not that way, or you approach it legally as opposed to extrajudicially, right? So in that sense, right, that what the approach does is it maybe along the way allows you to make some kind of is statement, but what it's ultimately doing is arranging a particular kind of taskscape in which that debate or question or research happens, right? So I mean, I think for me that's what rhetoric brings to this, is like, well, what this research would allow you to do is not to finally determine something. It would provide the available means with which you could determine it, which is with the question of right, artificial intelligence is the more important question. I think what we've been getting at, right, is not is or isn't. It's what with what taskscape do you want to, in which taskscape do you want to have that conversation, or with which terms do you want to have that conversation, or right, a Latourian question, with what parties, right? Who gets collected in the parliament that decides upon these questions, right? How
Yeah.
do you tell it, right? Telling matters in that context.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking about these because it's like that's seemingly um, something the third piece will at least engage with. It's like, well, what is in a broad sense? It's like, what is that piece doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think in that sense, it's doing it in that sense. What makes it theoretical is it's generating a practice of spectatorship and observing of this phenomenon, right? That we're using theory not to make the case, right? That theory theory itself, at least as I try to understand it, is not definitive, right? What theory provides is a mechanism whereby you can observe things, right? So in that sense, evolution is a theory, not because it's making a claim that evolution is in fact the case, right? Evolution is a theory that allows us to organize and observe other kinds of phenomenon, right? So it's a way of, it's a way of telling, right? It's a way of making sense.
Right.
And for us, that's what I think the case we're ultimately making is that's an important piece, right? Rather than jumping straight into, I've already got a notion of the human and I'm going to go try to find it or not. That what we're suggesting is that there a way to think about, right? What are other taskscapes in which you could be thinking about this? Because it's in taskscapes that notions of the human are always emerging, right? That we've kind of seen in our own work, but also in like Min-Soo Kang's work, right? That whatever the human is emerging out of a particular taskscape. So if you want to know what the human is, you've got to set up this whole apparatus that allows you to see it emerge in any given situation.
Yeah.
Which is, for me, what theory does, right? It arranges a kind of a particular, way of observing. Which is, I'm just pulling that from cultural techniques, right? Just so far as a door has a theory, a telescope has a theory, and a microscope has a theory. And they've got different theories because they are different practices of observing.
Yeah. That was, I wondered, did you see, I guess it was just yesterday. What's today? The 10th. I think it was either yesterday or the day before. Well, let me pull it up. It looks like the 8th. Chomsky had an op-ed about ChatGPT and its ilk. And, one takeaway from it is, well, these things don't think like humans. I was curious because it seems to have a harder, I mean, in part it defines, well, let me hold on. The false promise of ChatGPT. So like, I think maybe this is one. Yeah. So Borges, right? The revelation of understanding has not and will not, we submit, cannot occur if machine learning programs like ChatGPT continue to dominate the fields of AI. However useful these programs may be in some narrow domains, they can be helpful in computer programming, for example, although that's kind of mixed, or in suggesting rhymes or light verse. We know from the science of linguistics and the philosophy of knowledge that they differ profoundly from how humans reason and use language. So this kind of does explicitly, it's like, well, no, humans do this and machines do that. But in part, it's like, this was in part interesting. Well, I mean, I guess it's not a huge surprise from Chomsky, but it's like, there's a kind of circularity to this where it's like the philosophy of knowledge tells us that they don't do this. It's like, yeah, but you made that
right.
Point out that they don't, right? I mean,
no, this would be something that, when a future Dr. Min-Soo Kang writes a book, this article will be a part of that, right? This definition that I made of the human,
right,
says that you're not human. It's also, there's a part of me, again, right? My own kind of instincts are like, ugh. Philosophy of knowledge says this isn't human. I'm like, how's that worked out for human beings over the last 200 years?
And, in part that it's like, this definition of the human that is predicated on excluding this thing says that this thing is not part of it. Right. I mean, it's like, well, yeah, but I mean, the philosophy has embedded with it separation from the thing,
right.
This thing that says you are dumb tells me that you are dumb. It's like, well, yeah, that's inherent in what you've set up, right?
Which is weirdly, and this is not even pointing out an irony. It's like you understand that that's literally that sentence itself performs an operation of human thought that is precisely what algorithmic thought does, which
Yeah.
is based on my algorithm for determining what human intelligence is. This doesn't compute.
Yeah. My rule system.
My
Yeah.
the training set with which I've developed this definition doesn't include your thing, so therefore it's not included. Right? That's
Yeah.
the most like algorithmically written definition of why this algorithms don't count. Well, it doesn't. I mined my large language model and I didn't find you in it.
Um, so I don't know. I mean, it's interesting because, in part it's like, I don't want to just say, well, this is bad, because like it at the same time, it's like, I think there is utility in illuminating their different functions, right?
Yeah.
Where it's
Oh,
like
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
there are, and part of this piece does, where it's, it makes an assertion about um, different functions between those things. It is, it's always a little um, tough to swallow. It's like, but what do those distinctions mean, or from what do they result? I mean, particularly because like explicitly the conclusion of this is, and so based on these two things that they're doing differently, the conclusion is um, this is not like us.
Right.
Or, it's like kind of the conclusion is, it's like, well, it's not coming for our jobs yet. We're not displaced yet. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of the takeaway of this, the false promise of Chat GPT. It's like they may, um, topple us, but they're not there yet. That's kind
Mm-hmm.
of like what the question this is answering. Have the machines displaced us yet? And so
Yeah.
there's always kind of, it's like the whiff of Platonism, where it's like continually these things that are impinging upon the human domain make
Yeah.
our circle smaller and smaller. And so it's like, I mean, that's a frame, but it's like, that's a frame.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting too about that Chomsky is it's like it's good at programming and light rhythm or reverse, which is like, okay, well, we now know where Chomsky's right. Like, it can probably do music, but that's bullshit, right? It can't do right. It's already, I mean, again, not in a bad way, but it's a tell, right? It's like when,
What do
oh,
you
what's
value?
that book, right? The Cars book, The Shallows, right? Like human beings are getting stupid. What he means by that is we can't write long form arguments anymore. Well, and that might be, that's a perfectly valid criteria for what intelligence is, but it's also like, so coming up with light verse is apparently something that Chomsky doesn't think that's not fundamental, right? And writing programming, right? Which I imagine programmers might have something to say with, like, right? There's a certain, he is ranking certain kinds of human tasks as more human than other tasks. And so computer programming and generating some light verse, that's cool. We can offload that. That's not important to us.
And we'll notice, I mean, something that doesn't come up in this piece is chess. We're an interesting kind of, illuminating moment with that. I mean, it's important to, the original Mechanical Turk, but it's like we've seen that shift. Chess has become this icon from, well, no machine can replicate the imaginative human mind, where it's like, well, no, chess is now solved, and
Yeah.
therefore it's purely algorithmic. It's like, well, yeah, machine can do that now because it's just, there are only so many permutations of
Right.
chess pieces, even though it's a whole lot of them.
Right.
Um,
Because to a certain extent, chess is solvable, right? In that sense, it was in that sense, as soon as chess got invented, we were always going to lose at it. We were always going to lose to
yeah,
something that could calculate quicker than us, because that's right. That would be like, historically, I would go like, why did we pick chess? right? What any other things we could have, I don't know, right? But I'll, why not? Anyway, right. So in that sense, right, that oh, who's that? The author, like the idea that as soon as you invent the ship, you invent the shipwreck.
Hmm.
Right. So as soon as you invent chess, right? But chess was chess came, this is a feature of chess that
Yeah.
it's solvable. And so in that sense, right, it was, not destined for it, but in that sense, it's a taskscape in which this outcome is likely to emerge.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, it's interesting that it has now waned in this kind of demonstration. I mean, you can see this where it's like, well, but machines can't create art. I mean, this is a legal question right now because of things like Midjourney, Stable Diffusion, and DALL-E. Another domain where the term hallucination comes up, or tripping, right? I mean, that's often used that, what the machine generates seems to have these kind of psychedelic qualities, or sometimes surrealism is used, and that term's bandied about quite a bit. But I mean, at least in its sort of codification, it had to do with dream logic, right? It's like this is attempting to represent the ineffable experience of the dream, potentially to return it to what Latour is talking about, this notion of what the machine is creating there is hallucinogenic or psychedelic or dreamlike, and yet we don't ascribe those things to it. Right? It's like, well, yeah, but the machine still can't be an artist. Right now, it's a legal question. It's like, is what it creates stealing from its source material?
Yeah.
Is it an original artist? And the American legal system, I mean, I prophesied this, although it was super easy. It's like, there's no way our legal system is going to say that machine gets, intellectual property over what it's made.
Yeah.
There's nothing in our legal system has ever suggested. The only case that I can really think of is Citizens United. Big surprise. Because we said, no, a corporation is human-like enough that it can spend as much money as it wants on pushing a legal agenda, a political agenda, I should say. It's like, big surprise. That's the one area where the Supreme Court said, yeah, I guess there are some human-like activities by non-humans, but just about everything else, at least in this country, patents have been denied, authorship is, it's like, there's no way our legal system is at this juncture going to say they can do art or anything, like they can have any IP control.
Right.
We also, not too far from it, we have kind of that same posture with animals. There's no way that monkey gets IP over that photo it took of itself. We're not going to do it.
Yeah. Unless the monkey is an employee of a conglomerate.
Well, in that case, the conglomerate will get it.
That's true. That's right. That's right. No, the monkey doesn't get it either. It's Viacom gets it or something. Viacom, is that still a thing?
The name never dies. Yeah, that's another kind of well-worn thing is, well, no, you don't get it. Your company's going to.
Right.
Because you created it within their ambit. It's a feature of your employment.
Right.
Anywho, yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see, because something else that has come up, particularly in the context of telling, is poker, and how now the division between poker and chess, right? I mean, like, there was that piece that's like, well, chess has now become poker, because it's like it's been solved, so the whole thing now is feints and bluffs. Chess has been reduced to poker. There's that piece we have that talks about that. But that's an informative kind of distinction, because it's like, chess is not a game of deception in the sense of all the information is known. Everyone sees the board. There's only
Right.
so many permutations. So now the game really is, does my opponent think I'm doing X or Y? Whereas poker has long been the idea is you're telling information. It's like they don't know what cards I have. And so I don't want to tip them off to information, because once they have that information, they know how to leverage me.
Right.
It's interesting because it's like there's differences there. So it'll be an interesting question. It's like, because there are certainly poker playing machines.
Right.
But I mean, like, what's the relationship of like human-like play of a poker bot, versus a chess bot? It's like, do we see it as, well, it bluffed me, which,
Right.
for me is weird or whatever.
Yeah. When would they have the kind of Kasparov moment when he thought it was a human inside Deep Blue?
Anyway.
Okay. Now I'm going to read this Latour thing. I like theory machines. I think that's a good takeaway from today.
Is that already?
I'm going to give you credit for it.
It feels like
there's still that going back to that Hume machine. There was still I have notes I wanted to add. I think aesthetics or sensing to that piece, and I wanted to write an article called "The Pretty Hume Machine." But I can't remember if that's an article I wanted to write or just a band I wanted to form.
Well, I mean, it is a album title. I assumed that's what you were.
Yeah, probably that's where I was landing.
Pretty Hate Machine.
Whenever that fake band that Ryan Weber and I started in grad school, we're getting the band back together for an album called The Pretty Hume Machine.
Well, a 9 Inch Nails, well, I guess Trent Reznor, who is 9 Inch Nails, is pretty savvy about these things.
Yeah, I might be in trouble. I think the last album that we fake made was a last minute Baudrillard insertion. The single off of that one was "The Hyperreal is a Hyper Bitch."
Trying to see if that notion of
theory machine.
Yeah, it feels, this feels like just one of those things in the milieu. It's like, I don't know. Well, I guess we can take a look.
You're like, it's too good to be something I came up with. I'm not seeing logic theory machine, theory of machine.
That's the thing. It's like, it gets into things like Turing mechanisms and shit, where it's like,
that's not what we mean. We mean something. We're not doing, this is not a nerd thing.
Well, maybe someone will know. I don't know.
Yep. Let's just claim it's ours and then see if we get yelled at.
Right.
That's what peer review is for.
Peer review is to say, how are you unaware of this thing you're using? It's like, well, that's your job, I guess. You're telling me it.
Yeah. Listen, you don't have to peer review this.
That's ideally the value of it, is you're pointing out something that I should be aware of.
That's what I tell grad students all the time. Like, don't send it out, not when it's good. Send it out when you're ready to get yelled at.
There's a joke about that where it's like the way to get a question answered online isn't to ask the question, because then people will just jump down your throat.
Yeah.
It's to, I think you ask the question and then offer an incorrect reply. So, ask your question about how to do this, in Linux, and then immediately have, well, what you do is this. And then someone will correct you, because the internet can't help but correct everything, no matter how trivial. And of course, when we say correction, that doesn't necessarily mean you're actually getting it right. You're just imposing your own perspective on that, right?
Yeah.
As I often feel when I'm editing work, I'm like, I don't know if this is anymore, if this is right, or if it's just, no, you shouldn't be splitting your fucking infinitives. But I don't know if that's just me doing it,
Yeah, that might be. Like, that could be you.
Anywho. All right.
Okay, so next steps.
Geez, I don't know.
I guess keep plugging. I'm gonna read this Hume thing. And I'm also reading, I'm just kind of going back. I've been digging back into seeing like a state.
Yeah.
I've been looking at procedural rhetoric, Bogost's thing, see if that's something.
That comes up in the last one, you know.
Yeah. So I was kind of just pulling at some threads, and then I'm going to dig into some more of Ingold on Taskscapes. There's actually some things in here that I've not, about skill and tools and minds and machines, that I had not. I thought I'd read this whole book, but I hadn't. So I'm going to see if there's some, in his own work, some extensions of the Taskscape into some other directions, and then see what pops up.
Okie dokie.
Yeah, and then I'll reach out to that possible guest who
Yeah,
apparently.
we didn't talk about that. I mean, maybe we'll do that next time or whatever.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if it's that guest, I mean, I can certainly do, seeing as how we speak.
Yeah. No, I feel awful, but I cannot for the life of me remember that. So, and you're very withholding. So there is that.
Well, that's true. I don't, to return to a metaphor, show my cards, in part because it's like, well, you know, that piece isn't out yet. So I don't like to count chickens until they've hatched. And
yeah, but this whole project is counting our chickens before they've hatched.
Yeah, and I don't like it.
Oh, we got to episode 71. We finally got to I don't like it.
No, that was part of the inception.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's keep yeah, this one's in many ways our method is like, let's just keep thinking about this.
Yeah.
Kind of where we're at. I'm grasping at things I think will resonate. And then if I can assemble enough things that I think, you know, all these things are just like they're just footholds on this problem. So,
well, and oddly, we kind of have an entry into this piece, kind of the interesting case of sort of know how it's going to start. We just don't know where it's going to go. Usually it's the other way around. So.
We're not listening. We've known for like 2 months now how this is starting. The phrase anal beads is going to be in the first sentence. We know that. It's after that, it's just right now our draft is just anal beads ... No
Chat GPT in there.
Mm-hmm.
That's enough for a conference right there.
It's true, right? Yeah. Okay.
All right. Okay. Well, I'll see you in a. What's that?
I said I'll see you.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I'll see you in a fortnight.
All right. Bye.